Mesdames, Messieurs, chers collègues, chers amis, bonjour, bienvenue. I'm greatly honored to chair this exceptional panel on Indigenous peoples and the future of Canada. The Bahá'í world attaches great importance to Indigenous peoples and their spiritual traditions. Many have played prominent roles in our community, bringing with them unique perspectives on social transformation and the building of a just world. As the chair, Karen Mackay, just explained, 100 years ago, in 1916, following his historic visit to North America, Abdu'l-Bahá wrote that given the opportunity, Indigenous peoples would become spiritual leaders in the world. But in order to appreciate that great potential and glorious future, we must first understand the grievous past that has afflicted them. The unfortunate reality is that in almost every respect, Canada's Indigenous people suffer gross inequality. Infant mortality is 2.5 times the national average, and 40% of Indigenous children suffer from hunger. The homicide rate is 6 times the national average, and the incarceration rate is 10 times the national average. The UN and other international agencies have found that disappearances and murders of Indigenous women in Canada are part of a broader pattern of violence and discrimination against Indigenous women in Canada. In brief, the plight of Indigenous peoples presents a fundamental moral challenge to our self-conception as Canadians. For long, most Canadians were unaware of this grim reality. Out of sight, out of mind, the saying goes. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission helped change all that. It was a turning point, a national reckoning with the past that opened unprecedented possibilities for reconciliation and the building of a future in which Indigenous peoples can claim their rightful place in Canada's multicultural tapestry. By way of introduction to this theme, let us consider the story of Leona Bird, one of approximately 6,750 survivors who testified before the Commission. She told the story of how at the age of 6, she and her younger sister were forcibly separated from her family and sent to a residential school in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, where they faced humiliation and abuse. These are her words. And then we seen this army truck outside the place. And as we were walking towards it, kids were herded into there like cattle. Then, in the far distance, I seen my mother with my little sister. I went running to her, and she says, "Leona." She was crying, and I was so scared. I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know what was happening. My sister didn't cry because she didn't understand what's going to happen to us. It was time for me and her to go. And when we got in that truck, she just held me, pinched me and held on my skirt, "Mama, Mama." And then my mother couldn't do anything. She just stood there weeping. And then I took my little sister and tried to make her calm down. I just said, "We're going bye-bye. We're going somewhere for a little while." Nobody told us how long we were going to be gone. It's just like we were going into this big truck, and that's how it started. This story is but a glimpse of the reality that stands before us. In order to discuss the historic work of the Commission that has ushered in a new chapter in the history of Indigenous peoples in Canada, we're very privileged to have with us today Marie Wilson, one of the 3 members of the Commission. She's a distinguished journalist, trainer, and executive manager with honorary degrees from several universities. I'm very pleased to announce that she also recently received the Order of Canada and the Order of the Northwest Territories for her tremendous contributions to journalism, public service, and social justice. And what And what cannot go unsaid is that in order to be with us today, she cut short her vacation with her 11-year-old grandson. So he is now in the children's classes, but I want to thank him in his absence for letting us borrow his wonderful grandmother for this session. I'm also delighted that following Marie Wilson's lecture, we will have the privilege of hearing responses from two very special friends who have both played important roles in the commission process. The first is Eloge Butera, a remarkable human rights activist who currently serves as policy advisor to the Minister of Public Safety in Ottawa. Eloge is a survivor of the 1994 genocide in Rwanda. Despite the tragic loss of his father and other family members, he went on to study at McGill University's Faculty of Law, where I had the great pleasure of teaching him. On account of his extraordinary work, in 2013, Eloge was inducted as an honorary witness to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Last, but certainly not least, we will have the privilege of hearing from Bob Watts, who was the executive director of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and also served as the chief of staff to the Assembly of First Nations Chief Phil Fontaine. Bob is a graduate of Harvard University, otherwise known as the McGill of the South. I'm sorry. And my dean would never forgive me if I didn't say that. And an adjunct professor at Queen's University. He resides at Six Nations Reserve in Ontario. Having known this wonderful soul for some time, I can tell you that he is that silent one who's making great things happen from behind the scenes, and that includes his crucial role in making the Truth and Reconciliation Commission a reality. I would now ask you, ladies and gentlemen, to join me in giving a very warm welcome to Commissioner Mary Wilson.
Begin by giving thanks for the gift of life and of this day and the grace that has brought us all safely to it. Je vais commencer par reconnaître la journée et le don de cette journée de la part du Créateur. Je reconnais aussi qu'on est rejeuni sur le territoire historique et traditionnel des Haudenosaunee, les Mohawks, avec leurs voisins Wendat et Anishinaabe. On est très reconnaissant du bienvenu qu'on a reçu pour vivre ici tous ensemble. Je veux reconnaître aussi le professeur Shabnam Kwarala, que je n'ai pas encore rencontré, mais c'est lui qui m'a offert la belle invitation pour assister ici aujourd'hui. Et aussi, Payam, à vous, ça fait grand plaisir de vous rencontrer en personne, finalement, pour l'introduction très généreuse et surtout de la part de mon petit-fils, qui va être très content de savoir maintenant qu'il a 11 ans alors qu'il a 10 ans. I also very much want to acknowledge my fellow panelists, Eloge Butera and Bob Watts, who have become good friends, as so many of us have become over the course of the work of the Commission. And finally, and above all else, I want to acknowledge the presence of any and all residential school survivors and intergenerational survivors who are in our midst today, and I know that there are some of both, because you are at the heart of the work that I have been involved in, and you are at the heart of the big work which our country now faces, and which calls upon all of us to do our part. J'ai préparé mes remarques en anglais, mais si pour la discussion, on veut qu'il y ait des questions en français, on va faire la traduction. Pour la question du temps qui se déroule vite, je vais présenter mes remarques d'abord en anglais. I want to say that in anticipation of being here, it's been good to read and learn more about the Bahá'í faith. I myself was raised in the largest Protestant Christian church in the country, the United Church of Canada, where I still worship. However, I'm married into my husband's Dene Nation of the Northwest Territories, and my words of greeting initially and of salutation were in the Dene language. And that's where I've spent most of the past almost 40 years of my life. So I've also spent a lot of time in ceremonies involving the Roman Catholic Church, which is the faith tradition in contemporary times of many of the Dene communities. But I also know several of the northern traditional drum prayers. I carry an eagle feather that was given to me by an Indigenous elder and spiritual leader from Eastern Canada. I've been given a spirit name, Kiwedinigamun, in a traditional Cree ceremony from the Central Plains area. And I've been adopted into the Nichalnoth clan with an Indigenous name there, Chakwasakwithlam, the people of the West Coast. In fact, one of my greatest privileges as a commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada has been to visit so many Indigenous homelands, so many within Canada, and to witness the sacred traditions and practices that help define so many distinct peoples. Last week I was in Eastern Canada, and I was reminded in a little booklet of the story of Gluskap in Mi'kmaq mythology. Given his power by the Great Spirit, Gluskap was creator and teacher of the Mi'kmaq people. Gluskap created Mi'kmaqi, their traditional lands, and all its animals, giving them their shape and size. He also taught the Mi'kmaq to hunt, fish, cultivate, and travel by the stars. When Gluskap's work was done, creating and teaching the Mi'kmaq people, he hosted a great feast. And then he left the people, stepping into his canoe made of stone, and he paddled out to sea. As he left, he told them that those who lived kind and just lives would live forever beside him. No one knows where he went, but he traveled up a peaceful river where he waits until the day he returns to the people. Parts of that story, no doubt, sound familiar to you. And I could tell you similar creation stories of Yamoga and Yamoria, the creation stories of the Dene people where I live, including the stories of the Great Flood. And I mention these things because I think the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has been in part an invitation for us to begin to recognize that which we could not or would not see in the past, the many things that are universally sacred in all cultures, including our relationship with Creator, with the lands and water and all the wealth of the earth that surrounds us, and with the sacred bond between parent and child. Your own Bahá'í teachings, and I have a very superficial understanding, so please forgive me if I misrepresent anything, but you talk about these things on your website, that throughout history, God has sent to humanity a series of divine educators known as manifestations of God. Baha'u'llah, the latest of these messengers, explained that the religions of the world come from the same source and are, in essence, successive chapters of one religion from God. The conviction that we belong to one human family is at the heart of the Baha'i faith. Acceptance of the oneness of humanity demands that prejudice, whether racial, religious, or gender-related, must be totally eliminated. Imagine that. No racial, religious, or gender prejudice. Well, you must know that this was definitely not the political thinking or policy of the government of Canada just a few decades after your faith was founded in the 1800s. That policy held that certain ones of us were not in God's image at all, were imperfect, needing correction, needing Christianization, needing civilization, needing assimilation. When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents, who are savages. He is surrounded by savages, and though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training and mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write. Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence, and the only way to do that would be to put them in central training industrial schools where they will acquire the habits and modes of thought of white men. As a country, we've been slowly inheriting the ever-expanding mess of that attitude ever since it was first expressed in 1883 in the Canadian House of Commons by our very first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald. And for any visitors from the United States, John A. Macdonald was our George Washington. That attitude of racial superiority and spiritual superiority, and indeed gender superiority, marked the launch of the federal government's official policy on Indian residential schools, where children as young as 5 and sometimes younger were sent, often forcibly, as has already been mentioned, to faraway schools for months and sometimes for years at a time. It was a policy that did a great deal of harm to a great many children, some 150,000 children, over a great length of time in a country we all thought was so great. The last residential schools closed more than a century later, just recently, in fact, in the 1990s. So when we say it was a dark chapter in Canadian history, and when we know that there were schools pre-Confederation and that the last schools just recently closed, that's way more than a long chapter, a dark chapter. That is a ribbon that runs through most of the history of Canada. Well, in the 1990s, that's when the heroes of the residential schools started emerging. And no, it was not the government. Courageous, resilient, and visionary Indigenous people from every region of the country headed to the courts to challenge what had happened to their childhoods and to their families and communities. 80,000 living survivors of the residential school system tackled the 4 national Christian churches who ran the residential schools on contract to the government, as well as the federal government itself, which had imposed the residential school system without their consent and indeed without even their right to vote, which was taken away by federal legislation, without the right to protest, without the right to hire a lawyer, without the right to do any of those things of normal democratic expression. Making this clearly Canadian history and not Indigenous history. The 2007 Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement was and still is the largest class action lawsuit in the history of our country. And one of its hardest fought provisions was for the creation of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It was not created at all out of political leadership. It was an independent commission imposed on the government as a legal obligation, as a term of the settlement imposed and supervised by the courts. And its purpose was to reveal and address the harms caused by government policies and the state-sponsored institutions that were in place for more than a century. So it was very different from most TRCs that we think of in other parts of the world. Unique because the victims of harm were the ones who took action, not the political leadership. And unique as well because it focused, for the first time in the world, a Truth Commission specifically on harms to children and harms to children of a specific ethnicity. I was punished for who I was, not what I did. Please tell me what I did so wrong. I was just a little kid. Words spoken by just one of the almost 7,000 people who came forward, and not all, by the way, were survivors. Some were intergenerational survivors, and an important number were also non-Indigenous people who wanted to be on the record on what they thought about all of this. But these people came forward and were recorded over the course of our 6.5-year commission. Most who were survivors shared their childhood experiences of fear, hunger, loneliness, humiliation, abuse, and substandard education, when you consider all of this was done in the name of education, of being torn from their parents and homes, from everything familiar to them, and from any kind of adequate supervision or protection from the seemingly limitless examples of physical, emotional, sexual, and spiritual abuses they suffered. And I say that because I did not attend one hearing where I did not hear some new form of abuse that I had not heard before. I would say, surely I've heard it all by now. But no, limitless, it seemed. Now I have to make things right with people so my children can learn, and so they can tell their children they care. That came from the one who did not know how to love or care for her own children, since she did not experience love or care in residential school. If this history, our history, was shared in the education system, we'd build our self-esteem back to what it once was. We'd rebuild our generations, said another one. I want my identity back. Is that too much to ask? And so on and so on and so on. And every one of these statements, and in a few moments I'll share a video with you which will let you hear firsthand from some of these. But every one of these statements has taught us something as a commission and as a country. Let me simplify to 4 categories of things. Number 1, we need to learn. When it comes to residential schools and the Indigenous peoples of Canada, we are not the heroes of our own story. We need to start telling a more honest story in our schools and in our professional associations, and in our social gatherings and in our faith communities about what really happened. Of the more than 4,000 children who died in those schools and who have never been nationally commemorated or remembered. Of the tens of thousands of families that were devastated by the removal of their beloved children, and of all those mothers who had their roles ripped away from them. Of the hundreds of thousands of children who are still living with the legacy of the schools in the Canadian child welfare system because of the inability of their parents to raise them. We have got to start owning up to our history as a country and start working together to make things better for the people we have harmed through our own churches and governments and attitudes of superiority. Secondly, we need to remember. So we need to learn, but we also need to remember, not as a temporary flash in the pan, issue of the year, issue of even the decade. We need to remember to teach and educate our children and ourselves so that the curriculum of all children, not just Indigenous children, is honest about the history of a country that did not begin with the arrival of Europeans and subsequently many others from many other parts of the world. Thirdly, we need to connect the dots, to stop asking ourselves so easily, why are they that way? To grasp the correlation between high incidence of addictions and homelessness and undereducation, unemployment, rejection, poverty, child apprehension, family violence, incarceration, and epidemic Indigenous youth suicide. And by the way, on the issue of incarceration, it isn't quick or easy to say, why is there so much crime in the Indigenous community? It's more complex than that. We also need to look at the numbers and say, well, why then, given the same crime, are Indigenous people assigned jail time far more frequently than non-Indigenous offenders? That is not about crime, that is about at least the great potential of racism in the application and interpretation of justice. And fourthly, we need to change. We need to change. Reconciliation is about change. It's not about feeling good or saying nice things. It's about change. And change requires action. That's why in our TRC reports from last June and December, we do not talk about recommendations. We talk about calls to action, which somehow sound far less optional. The calls are directed to many levels of government, both public and Indigenous governments, but they are also directed to all and multiple sectors of society. In this section on churches and spirituality, we invite specifically all faith communities to take action by supporting and signing on to the creation of a new covenant of reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. We further invite all faith communities to formally renounce the doctrine of discovery, which was historically used by countries and courts to justify the diminishment and dehumanization of Indigenous peoples and the takeover of their unceded territorial lands. We also invite all faith communities to endorse the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and to use it actively as a framework for reconciliation and therefore decision-making. Beyond affiliations with any religion or spiritual community, we also ask the people of Canada, because people are not just members of faith communities, they're members of multiple communities and they're also individuals. We ask the people of Canada to commit to the ongoing individual and collective process of reconciliation. This is what was called for in our TRC mandate, that there would be ongoing reconciliation beyond the life of the Commission. And that's what we mean when reference was made to my friend and panelist, Eloge Butera, when he was introduced in part as a TRC honorary witness. That's why we have called on him and some 75 other prominent Canadians and international friends and supporters to stand as honorary witnesses, as an ongoing witness to the work of truth and reconciliation, and recognizing that it is indeed ongoing even after a commission has finished its work. Why? Well, so that we may live into our faith and our spiritual values, each of us in our own way, while respecting the ways of others. And some of those others are so very much older than our own, in fact. So that we may live into our values and treaty promises as a country, Canada having been founded on treaties, legally binding and morally binding laws and covenants, so that we may live into those values of our treaty promises and to live in peace and friendship and mutual regard. So that we may live into the apology, and you've no doubt heard about the multiple apologies, but including the official apology from the Government of Canada and the official apologies from all of the national political parties in Canada on behalf of the people of Canada. And that apology says very importantly that from here on, we will carry the burden of responsibility together with Indigenous peoples. But you know, the past is not just something to be apologized for. Anishinaabe Chief Gilbert Whiteduck of Kitigan-Zibi pointed out how easy it is to pay lip service to reconciliation. He said, "Is it an easy blanket of comfort trying to cover up painful realities, including the reality of how hard it is to even get a look into the windows of decision-making power. In Ottawa, in his quote, but perhaps one might also say in Washington or in many of the other countries of the world where there were also schools of this type and policies of this nature. I do not see, and the Commission does not see, reconciliation as a partisan issue at all. And as a society and even as a world community, we're all in this together. Many parties of many political stripes oversaw the long drawn-out history of residential schools in this country, and as I said, in the other countries that also had them, and did little to either improve or end the system. Today, we are all living with its continuing legacy, and what we do about that will determine the script. As I said, we are not the heroes of that part of our history, but what will be the narrative of Canada? What will be our role as described by our children and grandchildren when we become the ancestors of tomorrow? But what does reconciliation mean exactly? It's the question that we were asked so very often throughout our work, and the one that you're asking of this panel today. And the truth is, there is no one answer. When this came out at the beginning about residential schools, people coming out with their stories, I thought the words they were using were truth, healing, and reconciliation, said this one survivor. But somehow, it seems like we are going from truth-telling to reconciliation, to reconcile with our white brothers and sisters. My brothers and sisters, we have a lot of work to do in the middle. We should really lift up the word healing. We have many tears to shed before we even get to the word reconciliation. And another, we cannot perpetuate the paternalistic concept that only Aboriginal peoples are in need of healing. The perpetrators and society itself is wounded and marked by history in ways that are different from the victims, but both groups require healing. How can a conversation about reconciliation take place if all involved do not adopt an attitude of humility and respect? And another, the healing is happening, the reconciliation. I feel that there's some hope for us, not just as Canadians, but for the world, because I know I'm not the only one. That people across Canada, First Nations, are not the only ones. My brothers and sisters in New Zealand, Australia, Ireland, there's different areas of the world where this type of stuff happened. I don't see it happening in a year, but we can start making changes to laws and to education systems so that we can move forward. And this one, I'm so filled with belief and hope because even through all of the struggles, even through all of what has been disrupted, we can still hear the voice of the land. We can hear the care and love for the children. We can hear about our law. We can hear about our stories, our governance, our feasts, our medicines. We have work to do. Our relatives who have come from across the water, you still have work to do on your road. The land is made up of the dust of my ancestors' bones. And so to reconcile with the land and everything that has happened, there is much work to be done in order to create balance. So as you've already heard, and as we certainly heard throughout our commission's work, the concept of reconciliation means different things to different people. Sometimes it's extremely personal. The witnessing of a personal reconciliation. When a survivor, heartbroken, says to me, my only regret is that I was never able to tell my child that I loved her and that she is not here today to hear me say it now. And to have at the back of that gymnasium a door which was opened, and that daughter who walked from the back of the room up to sit beside her father, having heard the whole thing, and to say, "I love you, Dad." It was a moment of reconciliation at the most intimate personal realm. Our institutional and societal reconciliation may be far more challenging because it is less precise and clear as to what we need to do. And as you've also heard from many, many people, reconciliation is directly tied to healing. Both healing as an essential ingredient for reconciliation, but also healing as an outcome of what will come from reconciliation. In other words, healing that begets healing. This is exactly how the TRC mandate describes reconciliation: an ongoing individual and collective process that will require commitment from all those affected, including First Nations, Inuit, and Métis former Indian residential school students, their families, communities, religious entities, former school employees, government, are you ready? And the people of Canada. Reconciliation in the context of Indian residential schools is similar to dealing with a situation of family violence in a very simplified way. It's about coming to terms with events of the past in a manner that overcomes conflict and establishes a respectful and healthy relationship among people going forward. It's about establishing and maintaining a mutual respectful relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in this country. And I heard the previous session talking about relationships. I think you cannot underline and bold that word enough in your hearts. But in order for that to happen, there has to be awareness of the past, not just let's get over it, can't they get over it, let's move on. There has to be awareness of the past, and I assure you, we are nowhere close to having everyone in our country aware of the past. It's why I've taken the liberty of giving you some context for the Commission that some of you no doubt already know, but others of you perhaps not yet. We have to not tire of telling this story. So there has to be awareness of the past, there has to be acknowledgement of the harm that has been inflicted. There has to be atonement for the causes, which were causes imposed by mainstream society, not by the Indigenous peoples on themselves. They had no say. Present day is a different issue, where we all have to look at where do we sit and what is our role. That's where the action to change behavior needs to happen within Indigenous communities and within the broader society. And if I may, I would say that your own Bahá'í teachings seem very much in keeping with this. The fundamental principle of the oneness of humankind requires a profound development in our thinking. If you desire with all your heart friendship with every race on earth, it will become the desire of others, growing stronger and stronger until it reaches the minds of all. Noble thoughts in themselves, however, are not enough. They must be translated into action. The truth that humanity is one must today be constantly asserted and taught to all. Well, friends, we are not there yet. The relationship is not yet a mutually respectful one. As the TRC wrapped up its work in 2015, we've stated plainly that we believe we can get there, though, and we've offered thoughts and conclusions as to how we can get there. And we've underscored our shared belief as commissioners that we must get there. As we said in one of our own reports, we live in a 21st century global world. At stake is Canada's place as a prosperous, just, and inclusive democracy within that global world. The urgent need for reconciliation runs very deep in Canada, and although some progress has been made, significant barriers to reconciliation remain. Some of them were touched on in the introductory remarks, but I'll just underscore these. There have been very divisive and very highly publicized conflicts over Aboriginal education, child welfare, and justice. As I just noted a moment ago, too many Canadians still know little or nothing about the deep historical roots of these conflicts. And this lack of historical knowledge has serious consequences for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, and for Canada as a whole. Because where does it lead us? Well, in government circles, it makes for poor public policy decisions. And in the public realm, it reinforces racist attitudes and fuels distrust between Indigenous peoples and other Canadians. We are taught to be fearful of strangers, and we live in a country where we are, despite 150 years plus of coexistence, still strangers to each other. I sometimes, especially here in Quebec, remind people that just last year I was invited to be a speaker at a major event at the Harvard of the North. And it was called Aboriginal Awareness Week. And they were very proud to be celebrating their 5th anniversary. And I said, yes, indeed, great, and good for the organizers and visionaries behind it. But let us not lose sight of the irony that after 150 plus years of living together, and much longer in this city's about to celebrate its 400th anniversary, if I have my numbers right. After 400 years of cohabitation, we have to have a special event to declare awareness and to foster awareness. That's what I mean when I say we are not there. We are a long ways from there. But we are inching forward. Well, just to nail it one last time, if I may, history does play a very important role in reconciliation. To build for the future, Canadians must look to and learn from the past. And residential school survivors who publicly shared their residential school experiences at TRC events in every region of this country should all receive honorary doctorates in education, because they have been the teachers of our country, and they've launched a much-needed dialogue about what is necessary. Their wisdom informed our calls to action. What is necessary to heal themselves, their families, their communities, and indeed the nation as a whole. Canadians have much more to learn and to explore together about reconciliation. Aboriginal peoples have an important contribution to make to that reconciliation, and they are essential to its ongoing progress. We understood from the beginning as commissioners that reconciliation would not be achieved in the lifetime of our commission, and indeed probably not in our lifetime as human beings, but that the country could and must achieve reconciliation, take ongoing positive and concrete steps forward. The commission, as has been acknowledged, and I thank you for that, we have been, I hope, a helpful catalyst for deepening our national awareness of the meaning and potential of reconciliation in its infinite definitions and interpretations. But it will take many heads, hands, hearts, and spirits working together at all levels of society to maintain momentum in the years ahead. And it must go beyond cleaning up the past. It must also inspire Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples to transform the way we are in Canadian society, so that our children and grandchildren can live more honestly under the reputation that Canada paints for itself in the wider world. And so that here at home, we can live together in dignity, peace, and prosperity, shared prosperity, on these lands we now share. And so that Canada, on the eve of our 150th birthday next year, may begin to live up to our fullest potential as the greatest country we can yet become. I have two last little stories that I want to share with you, but I'm going to hold them because now I would like to just quickly play a short video that will take you on the journey of our commission. And I'll just forewarn you that it is tender in places, but you will see the breadth of the truth-telling, the healing that is there before your eyes, and the power and potential of reconciliation that sits before us all. So if I could ask for the video to be played now.
The very first time I talked about the residential school, I said it was just like I had these skeleton keys, and I went through a door in my mind, and I would go to each door and I would open them, and this one was fear, and this one was low self-esteem, and this one was sexual abuse, and the list goes on and on and on.
I remember the loneliness, the crying, and being witness to all the abuse around me.
I feel like I've been dropped from the sky. Nobody around me, strangers around me. They don't know us, I don't know them. I don't know how to socialize. I don't even know how to love.
I went through sexual abuse. I went through physical abuse, mental, spiritual. And I'll tell you, the one thing that we suffer the most is the mental and spiritual abuse that we carry the rest of our lives.
My mother and father had 13 children, and every single one of us had gone to residential school. I longed for the smell of spruce boughs and of the smoke, wood smoke. I longed for the taste of the dried meat and the dried fish. I was hungry for all of that time for my own food. And there was such a longing in my heart, such a loneliness for my people.
This individual, this perpetrator of mine, this is what the individual first heard when he was talking to me. I said, I'm sorry. I said, I'm sorry because for the last 50 years, I've hated you and I've wanted to kill you. That came from me. But that wasn't me speaking. That was that 7, 8, 9-year-old boy getting out whatever was still bothering him after 60, 65 years.
My youngest brother, his name Michael Antoine, he's 12 years old. And my mom and I were together and we got a call. He's in the hospital. He was in residential school. I wasn't by that. I walked into the hospital and he was black and blue. I was never so shocked in all of my life. And then a few days later, we got a call. We're still in the city, my mother and I, and we got a call at night and they said he passed. It's about us, it's about my brother, it's about the children that never came back.
By forgiving the church, by forgiving the abusers, and not carrying all of that garbage with us wherever we go, we invest in our own healing.
People ask me, what do you expect to achieve? The answer is freedom. I am free.
Forgiveness is not for the weak. When you forgive, you grow you heal, but most of all, you free your heart and you free yourself of anger, grief, blame, shame, guilt. Because anger is a spiritual sickness. But when you forgive, you actually live.
I'm proud to say that I opened those doors and I forgave.
Our failures fill us with deep regret. But as we know, regret and apology is not enough. The test of that regret and that apology, we know, will be our actions in the days ahead.
We are in the midst of a long and painful journey as we reflect on the cries that we did not or would not hear, and how we have behaved as a church. We travel this difficult road of repentance, reconciliation, and healing. We commit ourselves to work towards ensuring that we will never again use our power as a church to hurt others with attitudes of racial and spiritual superiority.
The Commission Chair, the eloquent Mr. Justice Sinclair, borrows a phrase that was used by the leaders of the American Civil Rights Movement. That phrase is, keep your eye on the prize. That sets a challenge for all of us, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, commissioners and citizens. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission will help define the prize. We as Canadians, as citizens, have to mobilize the eyes and help the larger Canadian population both see and act. Reconciliation in this context means coming together as a whole, with one purpose being to hear and to heal, and then a critical common purpose, which is to move forward together. And if we fail to do that, if we fail to go beyond apology and regret, if we admit the truth and ignore the reconciliation, that would be to repeat the profound offenses of the residential schools themselves. I believe that Canada, as a broad and generous country, could find the will to repair the damage of that past and build new partnerships if enough of our citizens know and if their eyes are turned to the prize.
So that takes you on a mini version of our journey with us. You know, I'm very touched by the fact that the Bahá'í, along with some other faith communities who were not parties to the settlement agreement, who did not run residential schools, have nonetheless stepped forward to say, we too are citizens and we too have something to contribute and to offer to reconciliation. Faith communities are presented as places of wisdom, spiritual wisdom, and also social justice activism. And as you've heard me say now in multiple ways, both are urgently needed. So I want to end with two quick stories, and one is from the very first TRC event I ever went to. And the short version of it is this. We were in a sharing circle outside on a very, very hot day in July. Survivors, non-Indigenous people, church leaders, government representatives, all sitting together, many for the first time ever in the same space. And it was tense. It was tentative. And it was oppressively hot. And at some point, this beautiful breeze came through the trees that we were sitting under and blew through the circle. and this elderly woman said, "You know, in our traditional ways, we don't have a building that we call church. We don't have anything physical. All of this is our church. And when we feel that breath of wind, we know that that is Spirit blowing through us, letting us know that we are being heard." And my very last event of the national events of the TRC included a morning traditional pipe ceremony. And similarly in that event, and this time it was a man, an elder, said, "Lucky for us, Creator speaks many languages. And lucky for us, there's no wrong way to pray." So I look forward to our discussion, and meanwhile, may I offer my thanks in some of the many ways we're beginning to acknowledge. Nyawan, Wilalyo, Nakumik Marialuk, Masicho, Miigwech Hai Hai, Kukshjam, Gunashchis. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marie, for the wonderful presentation and taking us back on this important journey that we've worked together. And thank you all for taking your time to spend a few days in Montreal in reflection, meditation, conversation, in refueling your minds to make sure that we continue to do well what we must, the important work of healing this world. I am humbled and honored to also be here at the invitation of one of my mentors, and truly a brother to me, Professor Akhavan. Every time I sit on a panel and he's moderating, the anxiety of the first exams doesn't go away. But I hope that this time he's not the one grading, it's you, so I'm in good hands. Reconciliation and justice are difficult conversations and difficult concepts to explain because, in my opinion, the work to be done and how it is to be done needs to be very much a full body experience. You cannot go to this with your mind alone. You need to bring your heart with you and feel the actual pain of the stories you want to hear. And you need to be willing to roll up your sleeve and do the work, the hard work. That if your mind and your heart have truly heard what is being said, you will actually go out there and do the difficult and complicated work of finding schools, ending this overrepresentation of Indigenous people in prison, and all the things that actually will mean that we have learned the lessons we were taught. I will only use the few minutes I have to share with you how I ended up on this journey and what this journey means to me as a Canadian and a survivor of a genocide in not too long ago. It's 22 years ago now, and I was watching the Olympics last night and I realized that Canada's leading Olympian is 16, so everything is in perspective. The Bahá'í community, very much like the Rwandan Tutsi, here I'm lucky to speak to a community that is very familiar with the painful reality of persecution at the urging and at the hands of a nation state. In my still young legal career, I have had the honor to work with the likes of Owen Cutler and Romeo Dallaire, who've advocated on behalf of the 7 elders of the community in Iran who are still held unjustly in prison. So when we think of justice and what all of this means, I know that freedom of exercising one's faith and the pain of having one's faith targeted as the object of violence and persecution is very familiar to you. So I won't go into some epistemological analysis of what that means, but I will take you back to the days when I was barely 11 years old, in April of 1994, when on the morning of April 7th, we were woken up by our house guard, who informed my father that 2 things had happened. One, his brother was dead, along with members of his family, and that a squadron of military personnel was going house to house, killing every Tutsi and their relatives from their home. We rushed out of our house, we went into hiding, and we spent the following 100 days begging and pleading and seeking shelter where we could find it to avoid what was a certain death. In this genocide that was predictable, preventable, extremely well documented, from the receiving end of this atrocity, to me the genocide looked like my neighbor, who was a patient of my father, and when he went to ask for a shelter, the man told him that he wouldn't hide the cockroaches, but he would appreciate his medical opinion on a rash that had come about on his back, because even though he was a cockroach, he was still a doctor. To the women and the young people who would try to go and rule us and get people, Tutsis, to leave their hiding places. To the many, way too many, who knew, who could have spoken out, but on account of fear or indifference, chose to look away. This wasn't only a sin by many Hutus in Rwanda. It wasn't a reaction by our neighbors, other Africans. It wasn't a reaction by former colonial powers. It was a quasi-universal reaction, at least by politicians, who, as Romeo Dallaire usually reminds us that in some of the briefings when he was trying to rally decision makers to come and help, one of them looked at him and said, "No help will come, General, because in Rwanda there are only people here and there's too many of them anyway." When I moved to Canada, a country that has truly offered so many opportunities, the story of indifference was actually not foreign to this land. As I was learning English in 2002 in Manitoba, one of the way I learned the word politically correct was in response to my outrage that my immigration status papers had a box where you had to check whether you're a Canadian, an immigrant, a refugee claimant, or an Indian, which reminded me of the identity card used to target Tutsis in Rwanda that demanded us to say whether you are Hutu, Tutsi, or Muto. So I went to my teacher, shocked, wondering how a country like Canada can live with this kind of discrimination. And he took the opportunity to tell me the meaning of the word politically correct, which was, in polite company, these kinds of questions don't get asked. My friend, reconciliation begins with justice, as our introducer pointed out, the way to find that truth, to actually know what happened. But the truth is often, way too often, the pain that real individuals, real human beings have to carry with them on a daily basis. And for most of us, there's nothing mere human beings can do to take that pain away. But the least we can do is to carry and bear that burden with them. So that's why once I heard the stories of the survivors of this residential school, their pain too became mine. And it is my responsibility to tell those stories the same way as it should be yours. The website is still there. Every story documented is truly your property. You should read those and you should bear that witness. The second thing is to roll up your sleeves and do the painful work of reminding all of us in the decision-making process that we ought to give it our best to make sure that the conditions, the injuries, the humiliation that has been historical to the communities is actually ended. This will take a long time. I'm truly blessed to be able to say that I'm using my legal education to this purpose as an advisor to our minister. But every one of us can do their share by learning both with the mind and the heart, by also doing probably the best place to start by asking the question, what can I do? So I will stop here, and I thank you very much for your attention. Merci.
Bonjour, Sego, Aloha Pa, Kenoshawa, Gamegis Indigenous Cause, Makwit Dodem. I'd like to first of all start off by recognizing the traditional territory that we're in, the Indigenous people of this territory. And as Marie Wilson said, this territory has been shared by a lot of different Indigenous nations over time. But in particular, I want to recognize the Mohawk people of Ganawagi just across the river. This matter of recognition isn't just a polite protocol, it's a matter of respect, it's a matter of honoring the Indigenous people, whatever territory that you're in, and recognizing there's a long, long history, a shared relationship with that land that goes back thousands and thousands of years. It's interesting, you mentioned the Olympics, and I recall when the Vancouver hosted the World, the International Olympic Committee made the decision to recognize the 4 host First Nations in that area as nation states. The leaders were recognized as heads of state, and they were part of welcoming the world to Canada. And in some ways, when I reflect on where we've come since those Vancouver Olympics, I think in some ways we've gone backwards in terms of recognition, in terms of relationship between the Indigenous people in this country and the country itself, and perhaps other places in the world. And in some ways, we've moved forward in some ways. We've gained some knowledge. We have the opportunity to, as Marie Wilson talked about applying knowledge. That knowledge is out there through the website, through the testimony of survivors, to help lead us forward. One of the great privileges I have is to teach at Queen's University part-time as an adjunct prof, and one of the courses I teach is a course on reconciliation. And in that course, Queen's University attracts a certain type of student. A lot of upper middle class Canadian youth attend the program. I teach in the School of Graduate Studies. And we attract a number of international students. So this spring, I taught the course on reconciliation. And I had some of the international students come up to me after about the second class and said, we took this class on Canadian political studies and political theory, and we're introduced to things like the Westminster model and how it's played itself out in Canada, and what a great nation that's developed as a result of that. Manifesting those important principles and values, and then you come and start teaching us something that's quite contrary to that. And so we went back and we asked our professor, what about the Indigenous people? And he said, oh yeah, there's have been some troubled spots in our history with Indigenous people and some troublemakers, but kind of focus on that manifestation of the Westminster model and you'll understand what Canada's all about. And so we found out that that's not true. The nation that we are so proud of has a lot of scars on it, has a lot of bruises, and those bruises are most manifest in terms of the lives lost and lives lived with the Indigenous peoples of this country. What I found in the classes that I taught is that the students go through a few different stages, and many of you may be experiencing that as we sit here today, or in terms of your own understanding about the relationship between Canada and the Indigenous peoples of this country. And they go through a stage, first of all, of disbelief, that there's no way that this could have happened in Canada, that this is maybe the story of a few people that's been blown out of proportion. And then we spend a bit of time on history, like we were introduced to today, and people sort of said, wow, so that is true. And they come to accept that this cultural genocide, as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and others have called it, happened in Canada. So they go through from disbelief to belief, and then they go to this stage of being angry. And oftentimes they're angry at their parents, they may be angry at their church, at their schools, at previous institutions that they've been part of, that they were never told this truth about the history of their country. And then many of them go to, well, what are we going to do about this? And a number of them design actions that they're going to take in terms of taking their place in terms of our national history. And it may be everything from just making sure that their children understand the history of Canada, through to reaching out in maybe even a more profound way in terms of trying to build relationships and bridges between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people in the country. So we see these different stages, and I think we'll see that in terms of the life of our own country, and we see some of those things being rolled out as we speak. While I was teaching this course, I almost thought I should throw away my syllabus because there's so many profound things happening. Canada at the United Nations saying that now they're going to accept the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and rising to the call that Truth and Reconciliation Commission made to Canada, and that Prime Minister Trudeau vowed to do as an election promise, was to implement all of those calls to action for the TRC. Some of that I'm thinking his reach may have overstepped what the government of Canada could actually do, but it was a great thing to say and to lead by example in terms of putting those calls to action into place. We've seen other things that have happened along the road. When I was Chief of Staff to the Assembly of First Nations, we sent a delegation of survivors and political leaders to meet with Pope Benedict and to receive an apology from the Catholic Church in terms of its role. The Catholic Church ran about 75% of residential schools in Canada. So there's no apology made, there's a statement of profound regret type of thing. But I remember meeting with a couple of the elders when they came back from the Vatican, and they talked about the significance of Pope Benedict blessing some of the pipes, sacred pipes and feathers that were taken to that historic ceremony. And I thought to myself, they were already sacred. So what's the significance of the Pope blessing them? They're sacred in their own right. And he said, for the time of first contact between the Catholic Church and the Indigenous peoples, not just here, but in other parts of the world, our sacred items were viewed as tools of the devil. And for him to touch them and to bless them was a profound recognition of the sacredness of those objects. And some of the elders said that it was more significant, it was a turning point in terms of our history than what an apology might have been. We have a lot of unlearning to do and learning to do in terms of our process. And we have important documents that can guide us, like the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which became the foundation for our Constitution in Canada and the treaty relationship that we enjoy with each other in Canada. Some of the unlearning talks about, and we see it in our own history books, about, this is from a history book from the United States, published in 1987. It said, for thousands of centuries in which humankind were evolving, forming communities, and building the beginnings of national civilizations in Africa, Asia, and Europe, America stood empty of mankind and its works. Europeans in the New World is the story of the creation of a civilization where none existed. So this is a story that so many of us have been raised with, that sort of this benevolent democracy, benevolent relationship that newcomers to this world have exhibited in terms of their relationship with Indigenous people. This is a story that we've all been told, and which now we know is not true. It's a falsehood. And we're challenged through the work of the TRC and through those stories of the survivors to, as others have talked about, to find a different way of dialoguing with each other, to create a different narrative. And as Baha'is, I think that we have a number of important principles. The Baha'i community of Canada has weighed in on the work of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples back in 1990, and more recently weighing in and putting forward a submission to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. A lot of it focused on some really important values and principles that as Baha'is we kind of take for granted, but we're also challenged to find a way of manifesting those important principles. The oneness of humanity, what does that mean in terms of our relationship with each other in Canada? What does it mean in terms of the work of the Government of Canada with child welfare, where Indigenous children are far more represented in the child welfare system, that the Human Rights Commission made specific recommendations just recently in terms of what the Government of Canada needs to do and the Government of Canada neglects to do. And I've had a chance, I worked in Ottawa for a number of years in very senior positions, and one of the things I've seen, I heard this many times from politicians, is that they would focus a lot more on Indigenous issues if only their constituency found it important. So constituency, that's you and I, that's each and every one of us, bringing to the attention of our elected leaders the need to share power, to demonstrate some of those values in terms of equity, in terms of justice, and the expectation that we have of our elected and non-elected leadership in terms of manifesting the importance of reconciliation in Canada, in terms of manifesting the importance of the oneness of humanity, the equality of men and women, power sharing, the sharing of wealth, sharing of resources. We've been told by a number of Indigenous intellectuals that reconciliation won't happen unless some of these things that as Baha'is that we hold really dear to our hearts, justice as an example, that it's important that we had this Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It's important that we had the settlement agreement. But those things in and of themselves aren't justice. They lead us and they show us a light, they show us some pathways towards how we can manifest justice, how we can manifest oneness, how we can manifest the unity that we all hold so dear and hope for. But it does require action. And I'm really happy that Marie Wilson talked about that the TRC didn't make a whole bunch of recommendations to us. That what they made was a whole bunch of calls to action. And those calls of action were to individuals, to families, to faith communities, to business communities, to sports communities, to cultural communities, to provinces, to territories, to federal government, to each and every one of us. So there's no place, there's no excuse for anyone in this country not to find a place in terms of manifesting reconciliation and putting in place this new paradigm that we're all so hopeful for on many, many levels, that great unity that we all hope for. And that's been promised, not just in the Baha'i faith, but in many, many other religions and faith movements, and been promised to the Indigenous people of this country. I'll just close by saying a couple of weeks ago I had the chance to meet Frank Akabuchi again. He was a federal representative when we negotiated this historic settlement agreement. And he said, you know, it's an interesting time that we're living in, that we've gone through and are sort of in a post-cultural genocide era, and trying to find how do we talk to each other, how do we live together, how do we find a way forward in terms of recognizing this genocide as part of our history. And he said, and finding that can be an important lesson to the whole world, because we see these sort of issues and problems all over the world and the incredible harm that's being done. And he said one of the amazing things in terms of Canada, and in particular the Indigenous people of Canada and other parts of the Americas, is that they keep putting their hand out and offering friendship, offering those things that were put in place in terms of the spirit and intent of those treaties, in terms of living together in a different way, and finding the one thing that we all have in common is the hope that we can leave this world a better place for our children and our grandchildren and those coming faces. So if there's nothing else that can be sort of at the core of reconciliation, I think it's that hope that we can leave this world a better place for those future generations. Miigwech.
Ladies and gentlemen, with great regrets, we have to close this session. We don't have time for discussion, and I'm sure you will agree with me that with these three extraordinary panelists, we could be here for a very long time, speaking about these issues of great consequence. In closing, I just wanted to share with you a few quick thoughts. First, there's a story which some of us may be familiar with as Baha'is. It's the story of Abdu'l-Baha's journey by train from Montreal, from this very same city, to Buffalo, New York on 9 September 1912. At about 3:30 p.m., as his train passed through the town of Belleville, Ontario, a 4-year-old Mohawk boy by the name of Jimmy Loft was sitting on a fence along the railroad tracks. At that exact moment, Abdu'l-Baha stood up and waved through the window to this 4-year-old boy, Jimmy. The little boy was so startled that he fell backwards off the fence. He never forgot the evocative image of what he described in later years as a man wearing a long flowing white robe waving from the train. This is how the 4-year-old child saw that image. Now in 1931, Jimmy married an Ojibwa woman by the name of Melba Wettung. She was the first Indigenous Bahá'í in Canada. So finally, Jimmy knew who that old man was. He settled with his wife in his ancestral Tiandinaga Reserve, where they served their impoverished community with dedication, inspired until their last days by the vision of the man with the white robe. Now, this story touches me, but after this discussion, we realized that Jimmy and Melba were part of that generation of children that were being sent to the residential schools. And there's this whole other story within this story of the unimaginable wounds which they probably carried. So I want to end simply by thanking all of our speakers, in particular Commissioner Wilson, for reminding us that when we talk about reconciliation, when we talk about human rights, when we talk about justice, these are not feel-good abstractions that we can pay lip service to. There is real, grievous wound, and it is right here in our own midst. It's in our own community. And I want to thank Commissioner Wilson for explaining to us that each of us, both as a faith community and as individuals, has an imperative responsibility to whatever we can, with whatever means are at our disposal, to help heal this wound so that our Indigenous brothers and sisters can finally, after so many years, be able to rise to the great spiritual destiny that is theirs. So I would like you to join me once more to thank Commissioner Wilson for cutting her vacation short and coming here, and to my dear brothers Eloge and Bob for their remarkable contributions. Thank you.